All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks to the organizers of this for putting BridgeConf together. There's been a ton of awesome content already today, and there's a ton of stuff left to check out after this. So thanks everybody for tuning in to my session, Code Commit Deploy, starting your 3-step journey to CI/CD pipelines. I'm Stephen Valdinger. I'm a senior support engineer here at Chocolatey Software. Little bio there on my title slide, and my social, you can get me github.com/StevieCoaster, and across all social media at social media. You can find me on Twitter, Slack, Discord, all the normal places. So to get started, what exactly is a pipeline anyways? I've talked to people in the past, and the way I like to explain it is that it's an assembly line for your code. The same way that manufacturing companies, like when you make a car or you produce anything really, you start with parts, you put them together, you make sure that they work, and then you ship them to your consumer. In terms of CI/CD and pipelines, typically that's a PowerShell module or software or something like that, where the parts are the code that you write that makes up the thing. QA can be considered testing, which is typically done with unit tests in C#. That's the C# way to do it. In PowerShell, that's Pester typically. And then for releasing, you're producing some sort of an artifact, whether that's a PowerShell module, new package, a binary or a zip of some kind, and then shipping that out or putting that somewhere that consumers can download it. And I've got the question thing up on another screen, so if you guys have questions along the way, I am monitoring that so that we can kind of get those in line and make sure we don't miss anything. I'll probably save some of them for the end, but if I see some that are kind of relevant in the moment, I'll try and answer those in line. And then a couple of resources. I'm going to talk about a very specific way of doing pipelines, since this is a kind of a 101 getting started type introduction to them. But there are also several different methods that you can use, especially if you're working with PowerShell. These are a bunch of different ways that you can handle those build steps that you will encounter. Pisaki, invoke build, PS depend, they all do more or less the same thing, and that they help you take your code that you've written and turn it into that PowerShell module that you then release onto the gallery, or whether that be the PowerShell gallery or some internal PowerShell feed that you're using for your organization. But they all do things a little bit differently. So I wanted to give you links to all of them so that you can go out there, review what each one of them does, their syntax. Some of them are a little bit more feature rich than others. Some of them, the syntax is a little bit harder to wrap your head around than others. But there's the 3 big ones that I've seen the most. And then the 4th one that's kind of not on this list, but that I'm going to be using, is just using a simple PowerShell script to get started. And full disclosure, I took this idea from a blog post I read quite a while ago when I was getting started with CI/CD, from Josh King over in New Zealand. He had a really simple PowerShell script that he was using to just kind of orchestrate what he was doing inside of his pipeline. And I'm like, man, for getting started, this is really good. So I'm going to be using that same approach that he used in that blog post. And I apologize, I didn't have the forethought to put that blog post on this resources slide, but this will be available on my GitHub after the talk, and I'll be sure to update the slide with a link to that blog post. So with that, we're done with slides because I absolutely loathe them. And we'll jump right into VS Code here. this is, if we look at the overall hierarchy of what I've got going on here, this is the build script. So this is a PowerShell code that's orchestrating what's going on inside of my pipeline. And I've broken it down using some switch parameters into individual steps that my pipeline executes. So the very first step that I do is a build step where I'm just producing some variables that my pipeline is going to use further on down the steps that it's going to take. The next part is the testing aspect, where I'm ensuring that Pester is on the box and then running all of the tests that it finds in the test folder, and then exporting out a XML results file so that I can have a historical view on the pipeline of the test results for each of my builds. And then the very last step is a deploy step, which may or may not be done in a build pipeline. You might do this particular aspect in a release pipeline, but we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So that's really all there is to at least getting started with CI/CD. You have a control script, in this case, this build.ps1, that's broken down into the individual pieces of whatever you need your pipeline to do. In this particular example, we're going to be building a chocolatey package inside of Azure DevOps by utilizing this PowerShell script, and then also a couple of extensions that are available in the Azure DevOps marketplace as well. So this is, for now, all the code that we're going to look at. And we'll head over here to Azure DevOps. Now, this is the Azure DevOps Pipelines interface. I've created a BridgeConf organization and set up a BridgeConf pipeline project. And I've created a couple of pipelines in here. Now I'm going to show off doing it two ways. The first way that I'm going to show off is really a way that I recommend for getting started. And even if you're seasoned at doing this stuff, it's a really great way to get your pipeline built and tested. And then we'll talk about the YAML after that. So if we click into here, and you'll see, full disclosure, I wanted to keep all of the builds that I've done to make this work in here so that you can see that, yes, doing pipelines, it sounds hard. It's not going to work your first time unless you're extremely, extremely lucky. And these green check marks you see at the very beginning where it looks like everything works, it actually didn't. I just didn't have my settings set up to fail the build if anything went wrong. So you can see at the very, yeah. I can zoom in just a little bit. Let me see. Is that better? Hopefully that's better for everybody. So we can see the very first run of this that I did. It did some things, but it didn't actually run anything at all. But eventually, after many, many, many failed attempts, I started to get things to work again. So if we click over here, we'll click edit, and we'll just go down through all the steps that I'm taking. So referencing that build.ps1 file, you'll see in the very first section here, I'm using an agent that's hosted by Azure Pipelines, and it's using this particular VS 2017 Win 2016 image. That's the default, but you have multiple images hosted by Azure that you can use. So if you're producing something that is a PowerShell module that's written in, say, for PowerShell core, that you want it to be compatible across Mac OS, Linux, Windows, all of those, you do have the ability to run jobs that basically do the same things, but they use different agents in that you can run it on Mac OS and make sure that everything is okay there. And then you can run the same bit of code again on a different agent for Ubuntu to make sure that everything is happy on Linux. And then similarly for these VS 2017 and Windows 2019 images, you can test it on Windows to make sure everything's fine. But I just left it with the default version here of VS 2017, Windows Server 2016, and I started to add steps to my job. And the very first step is to run this build.ps1 script with a build parameter. And what that is going to do is it's going to set this build switch to true. And I notice that if it's present, it's going to run this block of code here, which, since I'm creating a chocolatey package as part of my build process, I've gone out and I've just downloaded from the chocolatey community repository the Firefox package, and I've put it into this repository and I've checked it in. So there's no binaries or anything right in this. It's going to go out to the internet to install Firefox. But that's how I wanted it to be, nice and simple. So what this is going to do, I'm triggering things to happen for creating this package based on my commit message. So when I commit something to this repository, I'm wrapping the word Firefox in brackets, basically. And that's so that if I have more than one package that I'm working on inside of this repository, I can specify via commit message what package that I'm looking for, so that my get child item call down here in changes is going to look for whatever that regex match happened to be, and then everything else kind of falls into place. And then at the very end of it, this is grabbing a couple of things to be specific about the properties that I need from this filter object that gets returned. And then this is the Azure DevOps way of creating pipeline variables in line as you're running your pipeline. So you don't have to create all your variables beforehand. If you want to create variables that are used by later steps kind of dynamically as you go, you can use this write output syntax here. And I've got a link to the documentation right above it for creating those variables. So for example, later on in the pipeline, we'll use this package variable pretty heavily. So that's what this step here is doing. The next step is just running Pester. That's all we're doing. We've got that same build.ps1 file. We're telling it that we're going to test at this point, and what that's going to do is execute all of the Pester tests that are found in the test directory of my repository. The very next thing we do, since we're outputting the results of the Pester test in XML, is we publish those test results to the pipeline. And what that gives us is a really nice view of the overall pass-fail state of the Pester tests across the lifetime of this pipeline. The next step, what we do is we pack this chocolatey package, and I'm using the Azure Marketplace chocolatey extension for this. That way I have these nice, easy to fill out, what command do I want to run, where am I going to work from, and what's the name of the new spec file that I'm going to pack. And you'll see that I'm using new spec directory and new spec file here. Well, those are variables that I defined up here on the fly in step one. So that's where that write output VSO task stuff comes into play later. I was able to create those in the first step and then consume them later, starting down here in step 4. The very next thing I do after I've packed that package, and actually I should probably move this down now that I'm thinking about it. So now that I've moved that down, the next step that we're going to do is actually install this package that I just created. And actually, no, that's not going to work because that's going to throw off the rest of it. So we'll pack this package, we'll push this pipeline artifact, which basically means take the nupkeg or new package that was just created by the choco pack command and store it as an artifact of the pipeline. The next step, this chocolatey install step, takes that nupkeg that we just published to the pipeline and runs an install on it. Does this package install? Yes or no? And then subsequently, does it uninstall cleanly? And after we do all that, I'm using an on-premise build agent to download the pipeline artifact to a machine that I've got running here on my Mac. And then I run some PowerShell to find the nupkeg that I just downloaded, and then subsequently push it to a Nexus artifact or Nexus NuGet repository. So if I were to come in here and just queue this up and run this, we'll let this build. And we'll go back up here. And while this is building, I'm going to go over and jump to some questions and see if there's anything. Can you publish to an Azure DevOps feed? Absolutely. These artifacts, if we look at them here, you can absolutely publish your artifacts to this artifacts section here. You just need to create a feed, and then for your pipeline, tell that publish artifact step where that is basically. For your Pester step, would there be an instance where you use another arg other than test? In this particular case, no, but that's largely up to you and how you're executing your Pester tests. If you're doing it a certain way that requires additional arguments, or you need to change the way that works, that's the onus is on you to design that however you need it to work. For me, this is really simple. I've got a suite of Pester tests that run, and I just need Pester to invoke all the tests it finds in my test directory in my repository. So that allows me to just pass in one single parameter to that build script, and then Pester takes care of the rest. There's nothing else special there. And why put the variables in a build variable script instead of the variables section of the build pipeline? You absolutely could. This is just personal preference, in that I wanted to kind of have the control, the flow of my code in that build.ps1 script. I wanted it to be broken up into individual specific sections. So that's why I used that parameter block and all those different build, deploy, and test parameters that I have defined. That way on my pipeline, if we go back here and edit this again, that gives me a clear delineation of saying, this is my Pester, my testing step. So my build script needs to run the test section of that script, or at the very first. And this could be a build pipeline variables, could very well be compile my module into something usable later on. So in that example, my build step might be to grab all of the single PS1 files that I have in a source directory and create a new directory in the artifacts location of the pipeline, and grab all the content of each of those PS1 files and put them and use add content to put them in a PS1 file, and then build out a PSD1 file, and boom, you've got a module in a folder in your artifacts feed that you can then push up via another step to the PowerShell gallery. So there's all kinds of flexibility that is baked into doing the build script in this particular way that I find really advantageous. But again, you can do it however you want. I mean, the pipelines of themselves are just pipelines. There's tons of steps, tons of ways of doing things. You just kind of have to do what you think is best for your situation. So if we look, it looks like this is finished now. It's done. If we go back through here, you can see that we've done all of the steps of our pipeline. Everything looks to be good. Pester ran, all of them completed successfully. I was able to publish that test results. The pack operation worked. I was able to publish everything, and it installed and uninstalled fine. And it looks like that I was able to push that internally to my internal NuGet repository. And if we just take a quick look over here, and let me sign into this machine real quick. And let's have a quick look. Yeah. So I've got that Firefox repository stood up, or that Firefox package is now consumed inside of my Nexus repository. And then if I wanted to, I could come over here and Chaco install Firefox from it. It should work. Yep. All right, while that's running, I want to go back out to this run. And I had mentioned that I was doing a publish test step. This is what that ultimately ends up looking like after your pipeline is done running. So you can see that we've got how many total tests ran, and then we get a nice pretty graph of how many passed, how many failed, and how long it took to actually run those tests. And you can also publish code coverage results as well. Pester has the ability to do code coverage. So you can absolutely output that information as well. And let's go back one more step. I'm good at it. So a couple of things to take note of. I'm not really doing too much here, but a couple of really important considerations when you're doing this stuff, and it doesn't look obvious, but I'm actually doing it. You've got your parts, and thinking back to the manufacturing analogy I used at the very top of my talk, you don't just have parts assemble a thing and then test the thing and ship it. What a lot of manufacturing places do is they've got their parts, but they inspect their parts to make sure they're good before they assemble everything. And then after everything's assembled, they test it to make sure the thing works before they release it to the end customer. Think of a car. You've got a car with a radio and a battery and lights and a motor and all this stuff. All of those individual pieces were QA'd on their own before they came together to be formed into what is now a car. And then after the car has been completely built, a QA team will go over it, make sure there's no scratches, the headlights work, it starts, all of this stuff, and then it gets shipped to the customer. So the very first thing that I'm doing after I get a couple of variables created is I'm taking all of my parts, all of the individual pieces of this thing that I'm building, and I'm testing it. I'm making sure that Yes, in this particular case, it's just making sure that the new spec file has all of the appropriate information that it needs, that the Choco pack command will be able to do what it needs to do to make a chocolatey package. That's fine. And then I publish this test results and I pack the package. I create my thing. Once I create my thing, before I send it out to the customer, I test the thing by running Choco install and Choco uninstall. Now, in PowerShell development, you might have a source directory that has all of these individual PS1 files in it that you might run a suite of pester tests against that tests every individual file to make sure that the stuff that those individual files do works. That's great. And then your very next step will be to combine all of those things into a single PSM1 file, create a PSD1, turn it into a module. The next step in your pipeline before you release it to the PowerShell gallery should be to import that PSD1 into your PowerShell session and run your suite of pester tests again against the imported PSD1 to make sure that nothing in your build step that turned all of that code into a module didn't munge anything up, didn't leave a curly brace off somewhere or anything like that inside of the PS1 file, so that things like get command module, all of the expected functions from your functions to export section of your PSD1 match. All of that stuff is there. And then those individual functions do what they need to do when they're in the form of the module. Then, as long as all of those pester tests are good, then you can release it to rather the PowerShell gallery or your internal PowerShell module gallery if you run one. I know that Nexus has the ability, since it is NuGet, you have the ability to host PowerShell modules inside of Nexus and then set up PowerShell to use that as a source for your galleries. But it looks like, according to Chocolatey here, uh, that Firefox package worked. So that installed, it's all good. And there it is. Now, the next way that you can do pipelines is via YAML. YAML is awesome. YAML is frustrating. The documentation can sometimes be just as frustrating, if not more, than some of the other stuff that you're going to have to do. But this is what that same pipeline looks like in YAML. Now, there's a couple of things missing from this particular version of the YAML than what we just went through, because I added that second build agent and did all of the publishing to an internal source after I had this YAML created, and I just couldn't really be bothered to make them one for one. So if we look at this, we're doing basically, it's exactly the same. It's just written as code instead of done via a GUI inside of Azure DevOps. So if we were to look at this and kind of line it up a little bit, and let me get to the right page. We have things like the name of it is different here in my YAML because I can't have it be the same name because I've got two different pipelines running. So that second pipeline that we saw was called bridgeconf YAML, which got defined here. And I don't have any particular triggers set up on this GUI based version of the pipeline. I added those to the YAML after the fact because I've kind of got a standard template thing that I use to just copy it out of somewhere and put it in that I kind of like to use. So in this particular instance, the triggers for this YAML are going to be every time a commit happens against the master branch, Azure DevOps is going to run a build. And I'm excluding in this example a develop branch. And then I've got my individual jobs, which are, if we look at this, all of this first section here, this build and test is a job. This push to on-premise resource is a job. And then these individual pieces here are all the steps for that job. So we give this name a job, and the YAML version of the pipeline is called ChocoFun. And what is it going to run on? In this particular instance, it's going to run on the Windows latest VM image. And then it's just defining our steps. We have what kind of a task is it? It's version 2 of the PowerShell task. What's its name? We're going to call it build pipeline variables. What's its target type? In this example, we're using file path, which allows me to point to a particular file from the Git pool that the pipeline does to bring down all of the Git resources locally onto the build agent. And we're telling it to run that build.ps1 from the build folder and any arguments that we need to give it. Now, you can change this target type to inline and define a script that you just kind of run inline as part of the pipeline. So if I were to come over here and just real quickly add a PowerShell step, just look at it here. We've got file path and then inline, and then this gives you the ability to write PowerShell code right here inside of the pipeline or in your YAML that's not necessarily stored as a .ps1 file inside of your repository. So there is some flexibility there. The next task, the next job that we have to do, or the next step that we have to do inside of this pipeline is to publish his test results. So that's what this looks like here. And same, we're kind of just lifting and shifting all of the values that we see here and turning them into arguments or properties on this piece of YAML here. So we've got our test results format, which is this drop-down unit or drop-down list here. We've got several different kinds depending on what you're building. You might not particularly want N unit. You might want J unit or X unit or C test or BS test. Those are all the different types that this particular publish test results step supports at the minute. That could change. One never knows. And then it's similar. The test results file, literally copy and paste over here into this. The search folder, again, it's the same thing. And then fail task on failed test true. So we do set a couple of things on here. So similarly there, that's how you interact with those checkboxes, rather being true or false. And then same thing all the way down through here. This is our task for packing that package, publishing the artifact, doing the install, and then subsequently the uninstall. And that's where the particular YAML pipeline stops. You'll notice here that this chocolatey extension has a really weird long name. That's just what the name is when you look it up inside of the marketplace. And actually, can I browse the marketplace pretty easily? Yeah. So there's a ton of different stuff out here, and as you add things to it, you might not particularly know what the names of these things are as you're doing it, and that's why I recommend doing this GUI method when you're starting to build your pipelines. Because if you were to come back out here and say, here's this one, click this view YAML button, and here it all is in the YAML, so that you're able to just copy it and paste it out. And there is a way somewheres where there we go. View the YAML of this. So here's the full YAML for this entire section of the pipeline. And similarly, if I were to come down here and view this YAML, it would be this section here. And when you bring these in, you'll see that these code comments, that's just part of the Azure DevOps thing. You can safely delete those because when you bring it in as a YAML pipeline and run it, everything lines up. You don't have to worry about those comments. You can safely delete them. So that's kind of a good stopping point at the minute. So let me go over here and check for any questions. Yeah, so let's talk about that because it is the question is any suggestions to get to the pipeline task definer. I only seem to have access to the YAML file options. If we go over here and go to the right thing, pipelines, and say new pipeline, you'll notice that there's only a couple of things here. If we click this classic editor and then we say GitHub, and we'll just find this rich conf one again. So we'll select that, say the master branch. We can say configuration as code, apply, or we can say start with an empty job. So if we do the classic editor and then start with an empty job, then we get to the designer aspect. Is there a way to use variables in our build scripts? Absolutely. So let's take a look at this build.ps1. And we can kind of see a couple of them. So there are a couple different ways to handle environment variables inside of your build scripts. For example, the variables for, let me go back and grab this other pipeline and take a look at it. So publish a package artifact is a good one. So we've got this pipeline.workspace is a built-in variable for Azure pipelines. And you'll notice that it's $parenthesis pipeline.workspace. When you're interacting with those built-in variables that are something dot in Azure DevOps, those surface as environment variables inside of your PowerShell, but the periods are replaced with an underscore. So environment build underscore sources directory is what you're going to use for those built-in variables that are like that. You can also come over here to this variables tab, and you'll notice that there's a couple of different variables that are already pre-populated here. And I've added this particular one as a secret variable called Nexus API key. And that's so that on my push step where I'm publishing to that internal Nexus repository, I don't have the API key defined in plain text anywhere. It's a secret here and surfaced on the pipeline as this Nexus API key, and the pipeline picks that up and passes it over to this step as it's running. So yes, you can do it. They can be a little bit weird sometimes to get right. So if you look at the Azure Pipelines variables reference, they have some really good examples on how to do different things, and they also have um, some different methodologies on how you would call it. So I really recommend that you read the documentation for the variables and play around with it so that the scope that you expect it to be in is right and all that good stuff. Do you create your build in the GUI and then create a new one once you got the YAML syntax? Absolutely. That is how I do it every single time. Because if I were to sit down and have to write it from memory in YAML, I would probably be bald or an alcoholic because that would be super, super difficult, at least for me. I not good at YAML. I don't do pipelines all that often, so I'm not in there every day doing it to the point where it's muscle memory. And I find reading some of the documentation around the YAML for Azure pipelines is kind of hard for me to wrap around my head around. But that's kind of on me and just how I am when I'm trying to learn stuff. I'm very tactile in that I have to play with it and break it before I know it. And just reading YAML off of the screen is not very conducive for me to interact with it. So yes, I absolutely use the GUI every time, and then just export that YAML out, delete the GUI based version of the pipeline, or create a new pipeline and like append YAML to the end of it, as I did in this example, and just select that. So if I so we can do that here real quick. If we go new pipeline, classic editor, choose this. To search for it. It's like this, continue. And if I say YAML here and apply it, uh, it's going to ask me where it's at inside of the repo. So then I'm able to come in here and select it. So that's how you would do the YAML, or at least how I do the YAML when I'm setting up a pipeline. Do I ever use YAML templates or code generation to build it? No, I haven't really experimented with that too much. Um, Honestly, there's a ton of people that are way smarter than me that have Azure DevOps pipelines running that have them defined as YAML. And if I'm looking to do something similar, um, GitHub is awesome in that all of that stuff, as long as it's not a private repository, I can see what they did, which means I can copy and paste the code and change it to how I like it. So that's typically what I do, is just kind of look for examples from other people that I know are doing YAML. Um, I have not really worked with System Access Token or the Azure DevOps REST API at all, so I'm not very well versed in it to know much about it to explain it in any kind of conducive manner. I know there are all kinds of really cool REST API hooks that you can do on the back end to kick builds and pipelines and releases off. But I'm not familiar with them enough to explain them, especially to a large group. I don't want to send out a bunch of information that tends to be not correct, so I'd rather just not say anything. um, so pipeline security on private variables, sure. So these variables, once they are in, am I in the right pipeline? Hold on. I don't think I'm in the right one. Let me look at this. Go to edit. So we've got a couple of things. You'll see that this value is grayed out here. If I were to change this value back to plain text, the value is gone. I can't see it again. So setting up these API key variables are, once you set it, it tells you, hey, make sure that you know what you're doing here because you won't be able to see it again. And then, as far as I know, inside of the build logs and things like that, they're not surfaced when they're secret inside of build logs. I'm not 100% sure on that, so I don't want to say with absolute certainty that that's the case. But if you look at the secret variables section of the documentation, they do cover really, really well um, how they're encrypted, how to work with them, and the attack surface for those sorts of things. Do you ever manipulate the object and then convert to from YAML? No, no, can't say that I do. As I said, typically I'm just building this thing out via the GUI, and then afterwards I'll convert it to YAML, um, and then and then create my pipeline with YAML that way. And I find that once I have the YAML written and it's kind of there in front of me and I need to tweak things, um, over the life of the project, I can edit the YAML more or less easily in that I know that I need another task or I need to change a task. So I can just grab a particular task or section, copy it, paste it where I need it to go, and then modify that to suit the needs. So as the project changes and as the needs of the pipeline change, once I've gone through the exercise of working through the GUI and I have that YAML exported and then consuming the YAML in the pipeline, I just edit the YAML from that point forward. But really, once you have your project written and it's good and your pipeline works that first time, and everything publishes correctly, your pester tests are all good, unless you really drastically change what you need to do, you're not going to see yourself editing that YAML too much. Um, so yeah, that's good stuff. And I think that is pretty much everything I wanted to cover. If anybody's got any other questions or anything like that, feel free to throw them in that chat window that we've got going on.